This is Hannibal here from thehannibaltv.com with none other than former ECW world champion, former WWE, WCW, NWA superstar Shane Douglas. How are you doing today, sir?
Good, brother. What's going on, man?
Well, I'm back in Canada now where we're still on full lockdown until
Oh,
August here in Ontario.
till
I
August?
know you're at an event.
Yeah, we're down in Evansville, Indiana, and I stopped at a place today on the way, just instinctively, out of habit, pulled my mask up, and next thing I know, I walk in and everybody's inside has no masks on. So it was pretty nice, nice feeling of freedom.
I understand your bookings have been picking up where you've been booked almost every weekend in recent months. What's it like to be getting back into it after the time off?
Oh, what a great question! First of all, for us that spend our lives on the road, it's being locked down and not being able to go out and perform is like getting your right and left arm cut off. So to finally be back out there with real fans, the fans are excited. There's an exuberance in the fans. I think just for being able to get out again. And to be able to perform in front of them again, that's our life's blood, right? Being in front of the audience, and so to get that and have that kind of feeling and feedback from them is great.
There's a fan on here, Mike, that wants to know what were your thoughts on the passing of Bam Bam Bigelow? You had that classic ECW match with him.
Oh, Scott was. For the guys in the business know that when I talk about Scotty, I call him my big brother. Chris was my little brother, and most because of size stature, right? Chris was shorter, and Bammer was the giant he was. But Scott, you've been around the business long enough. The boys, there's some guys you just have friendships with, and that's great. And there's others you don't get along with, and then there's some guys like Bammer and Chris that were literally like your brothers. I had a great brother. I got great sisters. It's not like I needed more in my family, but we were all on the same wavelength. Easy to travel with. None of us was going out and partying after the shows. That kind of stuff. Scott stayed a little more private. He, always wanted to stay like at a hotel close by. Chris and I and Tammy and Francine would go out running around and whatever city we were in. But once we were in the buildings, it was seamless. There was never any issue of who's doing what or, positioning or that, I should talk more than this one or that one. But the reason I called him my big brother initially was he was the only person that called me Troy in the business. Everybody had called me Shane, God, since I was a kid in the business. And my ex-wife even called me Shane because she wasn't well versed enough to turn it on and off. She didn't want to be in front of fans and end up calling me Troy. And so the only two people on the planet that I always joke about that called me Troy was my mother and Bam Bam Bigelow. When Scott passed, I've been trying to connect with him for a couple of years. And I'd get a phone number for him. It'd be no good. Then it would take me 6 months to get another number. I'd get that. And they would, tell me how he just left the day before. Things like that. It was just this constant hurried rush, and he was out trying to find, reconnect with his family. And when I got the phone call that had happened, it broke my heart because the last time I saw Scott, we were on a show for Frank Goodman in New York, and it was a real hot August day, I believe, fall sometime, but really hot. And I looked down and Scott was dragging his bag. And, you've ever seen someone that's had their soul sucked out of them. That was Scott. His shoulders were slumped and he was just dragging his bag behind him. And he walked by me and didn't say anything. I said, "Hey, you walked by your brother without saying hello?" And he stopped and looked at me and he went, "Hi, Troy." And he kept dragging his bag and he walked in and sat down, chair pulled up to a wall and put his head against the wall. I walked up. I said, "Anything you want to talk about, big man?" He went, I was heartbroken for him. I had no idea what the issue was, but it was just painful to see somebody that you love in that situation. So for Chris and Bam Bam, we've all been hit, with very close friends we've lost in this business. But for me, Chris and Bam Bam are on a Japanese tour. They're booked overseas somewhere because I can't think of them in that way. thrilled and honored to have had the opportunity to have them as partners with a triple threat and what we created with the triple threat. Uh, and two guys gone way too soon. The business took a hit when those guys dropped.
Definitely. Bastion Booger wants to know your favorite XPW moment. And there was another question. Do you still have the XPW title?
I do still have the XPW title. My favorite segment that I can recall off the top of my head of XPW was when we had brought Chris in, and he and I were getting ready to work the angle. Uh, again with Chris, I was always jealous of Chris in this way. Chris was one of those guys, and there's a sliver of them in the business that can, be dead asleep over in the corner. You wake them up and say, "Hey, your music's playing." They go to the ring and have a 5-star match. I always had to really think it through and dig into it and twist it around a little bit and chew it up and digest it to be able to get it. And with him coming in like that, and obviously having Tammy there, and I had Lizzie Borden with me in XPW, it had all the chemistry for the right makings to do some good business.
As far as the most important championship you've ever won, would that have been the ECW championship?
Without question, because, and that's not to minimize any of the others, that my first title was the UWF TV title, and that was thrilling. I was a kid, didn't know what the hell I was doing, but at least it told you in your head you're being figured into the business side of things. The ECW belt, though, was different. I remember Paul distinctly telling me, never use World with the Eastern Championship belt because we knew it was a regional title. But the night that we threw down the NWA title and elevated Eastern to Extreme and the belt to World status, there was, first of all, there were exponentially more responsibilities, the interviews and things like that. A lot more demands for time from Japan and other places. And that belt, for better for worse, is what will define my career. So, the night of throwing that belt down, I always talk about this, there was no guarantee. I mean, in hindsight, sitting here in 2021, we can look back and say, hey, it worked. It got ECW over and it set us on the trajectory that became ECW legend. But at that time, at that moment, throwing that belt down, the NWA was still recognized, even though it had been out of business for quite a while, was still recognized as the most prestigious belt. There was a lot of baggage that could have gone with it. And if it had gone the negative way, that could have sealed my career. So it was a hell of a gamble that paid off for me, for ECW, and certainly the most special belt that I've ever held.
What do you think about the NWA? When Billy Corgan first took over, they had a lot of hoopla, but it seems to have pretty much fizzled out, and they've let Nick Aldis hold this title. I can't even remember the last big match he had. It may have been against Cody Rhodes a few years ago, but they seem to have dropped the ball on something that seemed to have a good start.
Yeah, they seem to have some buzz. I was excited for it. The thing with the NWA belt aside, that was an angle that we used in ECW. But for the legacy of NWA and for the boys, I'm a firm believer that a rising tide rises all ships. So when I heard that Corgan had bought it, I had some expectations. And what I was seeing, the few times that I would see it on YouTube, it had a different feel to it a bit, beckoning backwards in some ways. But then, like, my recollection of it is then the Jim Cornette thing hit and they fired him, and then the pandemic hit, and like you said, it sort of fizzled out. But when I came into the business or started getting into the business, there were, I think, 36 or 7 promotions still around the country. And so that meant I could get told no 35 times and still get a job. And once you got your foot in that door, you could do the 6, 8, 12-month run, wrap up there, loser leaves town, whatever, go to the next one, the next one, the next one. I'd always heard, I'd never confirmed the numbers, but I'd always heard at one point there were 10,000 wrestlers employed in the United States at that time. Probably true or thereabouts with independents, et cetera. But now you're seeing 100, 150 employed by WWE. I don't know how many AEW has, 50, 60, I'm guessing. So we're talking about hundreds compared to 10,000s of people that were making a good living from professional wrestling back then. So, it's the yin and the yang, but, the business has gone places that none of us could have imagined back then. But it's also had a very negative side. If you've watched any of the Dark Side of the Ring stuff, you can see there's an awful lot of darkness around it as well.
Have you seen any of these Dark Side of the Rings? I've found some of them are quite biased.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what's your opinion on them?
Well, they're going to be, right? I mean, in anything that's a written program, you're going to have the writer's bias and the directors and the producers and all of that. But the one thing that I did notice was, was that the few that I've watched maybe 3 episodes of them completely. That I was learning things that I hadn't heard before in some of them, and other things, confirming things that I had heard or that I knew firsthand. So, but I think the good side of it is that, and it's a little aside, but when you see, how well they're doing with their ratings on it, and the A&E biographies on Macho and Roddy and all those guys, that you can see it clearly, and we've talked about this 1,000 times, with the massive audience that has left professional wrestling or sports entertainment. They're still out there. And I think that's who's tuning into those things, to beckon back to those stories that they remembered as kids, hearing something about, in the case of the A&E Dark Side of the Ring, Vice's Dark Side of the Ring, excuse me, or, beckoning back to watching. A good friend of mine called me to ask about if I'd been watching biographies, and he said he spent his whole Sunday watching all of them. I said, why would you waste the whole Sunday doing that? And he said, these are the guys that I grew up loving. So when you see them beckoning back to those things, it's bringing those fans back to the table. But in my honest, humble opinion, I don't see those fans coming back to watch that and then saying, hey, let's tune into Monday Night Raw and see what's going on there. And if they do, they're going to tune out very quickly. I am flabbergasted at how badly the industry en masse, in toto, is missing it right now. When you watch it, you turn on the channels. If you weren't well versed enough in the guys' names and the ladies' names, other than the colors that are used in the setup of the building, I mean, obviously WWE is going to have a much bigger arena, but when you flip through them, there's almost no difference between product to product to product. And still none of those fans coming back, and we keep seeing Vince's ratings go like this. So, I mean, I said this jokingly 15 years ago. Are we just going to ride this out until it goes to zero? Or is somebody out there going to have the wherewithal and the forethought to say, maybe we should try some genuinely different trajectory?
Yeah, I think they did their second lowest rating of all time this week, 0.45.
Wow.
The A&E documentary last week was on the Warrior, and they had the Vice one on the Warrior this week. Did you ever have any interactions with him over the years?
I did. I got along quite well with Jim. I think in part because I was still a young kid at that time, right? Just, making my way in the business in 90, still climbing up that ladder somewhat. And I think he found like sort of a kindred spirit. I found him to be a very self-isolating person, very intelligent. When you talk to him, had he would say things that you wouldn't expect the Ultimate Warrior to say, right? Because it wasn't him; it was Jim Hellwig that was saying those things. But I remember one night specifically, and it really taught me some things and struck me as like how predatory the business can be. We were in Cleveland, Ohio, and the bar had been closed that night. It was a Sunday night, and they'd opened it up for just the wrestlers. And, so it was one of these little lobby bars. And so all the boys were milling around this little bar, and the phone rang. Hogan and Savage were standing over to my right, and the bartender took and went behind the wall, came back out and called Hogan, Terry, over the phone. And Terry went and got on the phone. After I saw him like roll his eyes at Macho, and then went behind the wall for, I don't know, 5-10 minutes, and came out and said, I need to go upstairs and babysit and I forget, like he had some kind of nickname for him, like Babysit the Baby or whatever, something like that. And he was up there for a while and came back down maybe a half hour later, 45 minutes later, and said something about taking too many steroids and he's freaking out again. So, like, to me, now looking back, I took that as here's a young guy who's not clearly ready for the spotlight or able to handle the spotlight. You're like the guy that should be leading him, right? I mean, you're the guy that's been in that spotlight, and you know all the pratfalls that can go with that and pressures. So maybe guide him a little bit. And I quickly realized in my head they don't want to. They're hoping that he flounders, so that Vince says, "Well, okay, Terry, let's put you back in spot," or whoever. But eye-opening for me as a kid.
Joker Fish would like to know your favorite city to wrestle in on the road.
On the road, I was obviously going to say Pittsburgh because every time the first time I wrestled in the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, to me it was like magic. This is where I was a kid sitting right back over there, and used to watch all my heroes, and my dad used to take me, so it was like a really special place for me to finally have wrestled there. The Garden was another because you grew up hearing about the mecca of professional wrestling in Madison Square Garden, New York City. For me, though, being on the road, and I know this is going to sound self-serving, but I mean it from the bottom of my heart. The ECW arena, to me, as filthy, dirty, I mean, raw sewage coming out of the bathrooms and stacks of old newspapers in the back and rats running around back there and everything. Real rats, not the other kind. There was and it sounds cliche, but there was a magic in that building. Looking back, I'd never seen that kind of enthusiasm in fans before then, and I haven't seen it since en masse. You'll see it in spurts in places, but not that start to finish. Some of those shows, I believe we used to start around 7:30. It was rare that in the main event I would go to the ring before midnight. So those were some pretty damn long shows, and I don't remember the fans ever getting tired or not being as enthusiastic as they were. So there were, again, it sounds like I'm just saying that because, of my ECW connection, but there was something genuinely different there in that building.
Bryce Boudreau would like to know about the Cookiegate situation from TNA. I'm not familiar with that myself.
Oh, okay. That was, we were trying to be nice. Right, we were at TNA taping one day, and his name will come to me in a second. He had come from the WWF and had done their vignettes and things. And he came into the production meeting and said, "Hey, we just heard WWF is going to be filming a commercial in the studio next to ours." So right away, all of our gremlin horns came out. Right, and how can we maximize this? And we quickly settled on, let's take trays of cookies and balloons and welcome our brothers into Universal Studios. They were outside waiting, and I remember Flair had on like a George Washington wig or something. It was really strange. They were all outside eating lunch. And we came from several different angles. We came from the back side of the building, directly across from our building, from across the street from their building, and all with TV crews, and walking in with trays of cookies and balloons for everybody. And as soon as they saw us, they wigged the hell out like we were like radioactive or something. They all started jumping up and running back into the studio. John, I forget his last name, the big security guy, when I went to him with my life, "Hey, John, welcome to Universal Studios." And he literally threw himself into the wall, like I was going to stab him or something. And, we sat and watched them. And of course, after a few minutes, they were all gone. We left. They had threatened to call security or something stupid like that. And now when we filmed them, this was all in the public area in Universal Studios. We'd never entered their studio, and they never entered ours. But right after, they sent somebody over and threatened a lawsuit if we used any of that footage. And, people like me and Jeff Jarrett were telling Dixie, it's public area, Dixie, they can't do anything about it. And in typical Dixie fashion, she acquiesced, right? She dropped the footage. To my knowledge, I don't know if it's ever been, I know TNA never used it. I'm sure it's probably in some place or form leaked out somewhere. But that was the kind of thing that at that time I think could have adapting that kind of FTW attitude for TNA would have been a good thing, because we were still very, very much the small upstart. So after I'd left and I seen Dixie, I'm talking about the coming wars, renewal of the Monday Night Wars and all of that, you knew it was going to be a massacre. They were nowhere near ready for that. And but that one day with the Cookiegate. Had they followed that trajectory a little bit, who knows where it would have gone and what it might have done. My take from ECW is wrestling fans like to see that little bit of in your face, but you got to be ready you got to be ready to run when that time comes.
Donnie has a follow-up question to that fits in pretty well. If you were a promoter, which you have been numerous times in your career, what would you change about wrestling?
We just doubled the size of the show. Actually, pretty simple, right? You've got, and again, these are all going to sound very trite, but they're not, because it's become rocket science. You clearly defined characters, clearly written storylines, clear objectives in what you're trying to gain. And I would pull a lot of Bill Watts stuff, right? And people have heard me talk about Watts over the years, often in the negative light, but I don't tell them for those stories for that reason. I tell it because it forced me to learn my craft. If like, for instance, when the empty arena thing hit, right? That's a curveball to anybody. If I was promoting then, I would put in the same thing. Tough to figure out how do you make this show compelling. Well, AEW's got a roster full of kids that the masses, those 50 million that have tuned out of professional wrestling, are largely unfamiliar with. So how about you take the first half of the show, or first 20 minutes, and introduce us to this character. Explain to us what makes Pac pissed off at the world. Explain to us why Hangman wears denim and dresses like a cowboy. Is he really a cowboy, or is that a wrestling gimmick? Then at the end of that show, have a good 10-minute match between these two. At least now you have some semblance of buy-in to why you're liking or disliking these characters. And that was the question was asked to me at that time live on my podcast, and I've never given those questions beforehand. And I said, that was just off the top of my head. If you gave me an hour or two to sit down, I could come up with probably 20 or 30 more things we could do. But the other big thing to me today, it's a big stickler to me, is because this was drilled into my head nightly. Be different, kid. Find a way to be different. I can hear that echoing in my brain even today. When I turn on the shows today, the buck 80, buck 90, well-built abs, a little bit of facial hair, tattoos, same bicycle trunks, some artwork on the bicycle trunks. The only difference is they're different colors, right? Or their hair might be a different color. But wrestler A looks like wrestler B, looks like wrestler C, D, E, F, and G. It's vanilla, old-fashioned vanilla, vanilla bean, vanilla flambe. It's all vanilla. Find a way to be different. And I can already hear the stickers that go, well, this guy's bigger, or this guy wears different trunks. And Matt, I'm talking from start to finish of the show. And it perplexes me as to why somebody in the back isn't seeing this and making those changes. For the fans that don't or aren't familiar with me, I am a professional wrestling mark. I love good professional wrestling. Underscore the word good. So there's all these years I'm dying and waiting, like with these kids' jaw-dropping athleticism. What would they create if we could snap our fingers, find a time machine, and take them back to when I was a kid coming into the business, and literally everybody in that dressing room is a future Hall of Famer or legend or icon. And then you got Bill Watts, the cowboy, with his ways back then. My guess is with their athleticism, they would create magic. And the mark in me keeps holding my breath and crossing my fingers. Please, please, please get it right. And then Steamboat said it best last week at a seminar I was sitting in. I love listening to him. He said, the kids start the match here and they take it here. Exact opposite. It should be here to here. And, they start the match off with, if it ain't punch kick, it's backflip and running a million miles an hour. Well, once you've done that, where do you go with that? How do you top it? How do you keep that, as Steamboat used to teach, the segues, the small things making the big things important. If everything is just a huge, incredible athletic spot and move that just keeps going, where do you take the match from there? Where do you tell the story in there? And that's all been lost. So, sadly, the longer we go staying off the rails, like I would call it, each of us is getting fatter. Each of us is getting older. We lost New Jack a few weeks ago. Tracy Smothers, one of the great unsung trainers of our business. In 10, 15, 20, 25 years, will anybody still be around that can even teach it, that even understands it? So I think our business is in a real precarious position right now. Back when I was a kid, used to have roller derby, and then right after roller derby would be studio wrestling. Well, when's the last time you saw roller derby on television, right? It went extinct and they tried to bring it back a couple times, never gets back over. It didn't change with the times, it didn't adapt. And when they tried the last incarnation, they had gotten so far away from what roller derby had been that none of those fans came back. I think we're in that same crossroads right now, that if we don't start to push it back, to get it back to some semblance of storytelling, believable characters, well-defined characters, and just some common sense to the business, that our kids will be saying 20 years from now, 30 years from now, hey, remember when we were kids and they used to have this thing on called professional wrestling where they wore boots and tights and would go to the ring and bounce off the ropes? That's what we'll get in 25 years.
You mentioned the passing of New Jack. A couple fans on here have wanted to know your opinion on that.
Oh, about his passing, was heartbroken when I heard it. Wasn't shocked. Right, Jack lived, as the fans all know, he lived fast and he lived hard. But Jack was one of the ingredients of many that went into ECW that made it so special and so different. He used to come back from the ring and, his heart would be beating a million miles an hour, and he'd collapse in the dressing room. I tell him, dude, like, stop. Do it. There's different ways you can do this, and not. When you're 25 and all the kids out there listening to this, please listen to this. There was a time you could drop us off of the buildings, or Jack diving off of God knows what, and get right back up and go to the back and have a beer, and nothing hurt. But what you do when you're 25 or 35 comes with you when you're 50, 55, 60. And if you did a little too much back then, it could get you now. The old saying, you are what you eat, right? It's your body's your temple, that sort of thing. And I know that all sounds corny and sort of stupid, but other than the OxyContin, drugs were never my deal. And I can probably count on my fingers and toes how many times in my life I've been legally drunk. I don't like the feeling. I like having a couple drinks with my friends and shooting the shit with my friends. I just don't like the feeling of being inebriated and, the bed spins and all of that. So my experience of partying on the road is vastly different from the majority of the people partying on the road. More times than not, I was up in my room either with Francine at that period or with whoever I was traveling with at the time, and either sleeping before they got back after the bar closed, or watching ESPN or HBO or something. New Jack's passing, again, it sounds like cliches. There's been so many things said. There will never be another New Jack, right? When I watched the Vice segment on him, I've known Jack since, let me think, 96 or 7. So quite a while, a quarter century or better. There were things in there that I learned. Remember, I said earlier that I'd learned I didn't know previously. I was completely unaware of his upbringing. You'd hear Jack say some of those things in his promos. And to be honest with you, when Jack got to the building, you weren't quite sure where Jerome Young dropped off and New Jack picked up. They became sort of one and the same. But I did have the kind of relationship with Jack that mostly was forged later in TNA, where he and I would sit in hotel rooms and just BS for a couple hours, and no partying or anything, just sitting there and bullshitting, and got to see a completely different side of him than what the cameras see or what we saw in the ECW dressing room. And there was a damn good guy under that, but a damn good guy that you didn't want to fool with. And I the way I liken it in my head is that New Jack was the front that Jerome Young put up to protect him from all that stuff that we heard in the Vice Dark Side of the Ring, and and that was a legit thing. Jack wasn't just going to walk, be the guy that barked. He also had a bite to go with that if it had to. But he and I, would joke around and say things in the dressing room to each other that most people would find distasteful or politically incorrect by today's standards. But that's the kind of relationship that we had. We were brothers. And, that just, again, a little sidebar for me. I think that's where our world right now and all the craziness that we're seeing, you're still living through a shutdown up there in Canada, is, I'm a political scientist, right? I taught it for 7 years. I've spent my adult life learning it. But believe it or not, as much as I love politics, there are times that I don't want politics. If I turn on wrestling, I don't give a rat's ass what your politics are. If I turn on a football game, a basketball game, I want to watch football, basketball, wrestling, racing, whatever. There's a place for politics and there's places for not politics. Most people want to turn on sports to get away from all that insanity, and yet it's being bled in. You're one of the boys, so being in the dressing room is a completely different world. One time in an ECW promo, I used the antiquated, and from the old world, the inner holy of holies, right? This is the one place we can go and still be us. We can let our hair down. We can say whatever we want to each other. We can fight. We can kiss, hug, whatever. That's our inner sanctum. And Jack and I had a special kind of relationship there. And so for his passing, to answer the question, finally, I was heartbroken to hear it. Not shocked, but heartbroken.
Matt says he was at the Great American Bash 2000. I guess you may have fought the wall there, because he's asking if you have any thoughts on the wall. And he also wants to know if you enjoyed wrestling in Baltimore.
In Baltimore's always great, right? I loved going there once I became a heel because as a babyface, your Baltimores and your Philadelphias and your New Yorks and Trentons, they hated baby faces, right? So they didn't matter how hard you worked, they were just going to chew you up. But I always loved working in Baltimore, especially after becoming here, because the crowds were always so alive. Jerry Tootie, the Wall. In this business, you hear the term, well, he's a big guy. Jerry was one of those guys that was massive in just stature and his physical size. He wasn't a giant, but probably in the range of 6, 8, 9, 10. I mean, big guy. But his shoulders were like so wide as well. Just a big man. That was an incredible athlete. And I first met Jerry in ECW. He was friends with Bam Bam. And Bam Bam brought him there. He worked, I think, once or twice in ECW and then popped up in WCW not long after that. And so later when Bammer and I went there, we all fell back in together. Jerry was a good guy. Just loved wrestling and loved being around it. Very quiet guy. For as big as he was, you don't usually expect that with the bigger guys. But I think he was just, even though he'd been around the business for some time at that point, he was still enamored by the business. It was still magic to him. And, there's an innocence to that some will take advantage of. For me, it was sort of cool to see. And he and I traveled one time, because WCW back then would throw us on the road and, fly us into point A, and we'd travel around to BC, halfway across the country. And back then, sort of dated ourselves, I guess. He had one of those portable CD players, DVD players. And we're driving down the road, middle of the night, and he's got Pink Floyd, The Wall, and the movie. And I remember sort of trying to drive and keep my eyes on the movie, to follow along with the movie. But that was what it was like hanging out with Jerry. He was very laid back. Wasn't much into the partying scene as far as going out and drinking and that kind of thing. I'd heard other people saying, well, he likes to do this or that. I never saw that in him. I rarely saw that in him, right? You always see the guys imbibing here and there, some a lot, some not so much. But Jerry was one of the guys not so much. And I don't know if it was just something he kayfabed from me, or if it was more genuine as to what I was seeing. When I had heard that he had committed suicide, I believe it was suicide, I was devastated because, like I always say about the guys, uh, we have a lot of acquaintances in the business, right? And an awful lot of people that, that say they're friends, say they love you, and then as soon as you're out of the territory, you never hear from them again. But each of us has a handful of guys that we get close to in the business. And for me, I always felt like people like Jerry, that if they, whatever kind of problems you're having, there's always an answer, right? It may not be right there in front of you. But like just in a match, you and I are going to come up with a much better match than I would or you would. Same thing here. I just wish like hell he had reached out and talked to anybody, before doing something like that.
Kale has a question for you. What are your thoughts on Buff Bagwell's latest arrest and the issues he's been dealing with?
Yeah, same thing. Same sentiments as I just said about Jerry. Right? We know how this story ends. We've seen this movie enough. It's like watching, pro wrestling episode 943. Right? I know how it ends. Buff and I were kids in the business. I mean, babies in the business coming in. But I've also had, because of the OxyContin, have some experience with that. Wish I didn't, but I know what an awful road it is and how seemingly impossible it is to get clean, to get away from that. But honestly, when you reach this stage of it, and the last I took OxyContin was December 22nd, 2005. Would never touch that shit again. If you put $1 million on the table, and I'd think about it because it's a lot of money, but then I'd eventually tell you to shove it up. You know what? It should have killed me, and damn near did. So when I see a friend and a brother and a co-worker going through that same thing, it's hard work. But hard work is not something professional wrestlers shy away from. Being on the road is damn hard work. Building a physique like Buff has is damn hard work. So it's just hard work of a different kind. But like my thinking on it is, you hear people say stuff like, I want to, leave a pretty corpse. Not me, brother. I want people to walk up to that casket and say, holy shit, how old was that dude? I want to leave a dried up, shriveled up, wrinkled up husk when I'm gone. For me, and I know it sounds corny. I just shared this with another friend here recently. When I finally got off the OxyContin, 5 years of my life had been spent pretty much 24/7 thinking about OxyContin. How much do I have left? When do I need my next script? How am I going to get my next script? Well, it was like a prison sentence. True, they talk about the insanity of addiction. And doing the same thing over and over again, and for some reason expecting a different outcome. I hope, and if Buff needs to reach out, please do. I'm concerned because again, we know how that movie ends, and Buff's one of the good guys, and when we both were kids, neither of us were doing that kind of crap, right? And the business takes the pressures and the injuries, etc. Easy enough to understand how it happens. But now that we've reached this stage of our life, it used to be like you laugh at the guys that took too many pills and were falling down and stuff like that, but they were safe, right? They're around the boys, safe as they're going to be in that situation. But now when you see this bleeding out into the larger world, I'm just so thankful for Marcus, knowing him like I know him, that he didn't hurt somebody else. Because it sounds to me like just reading that report that could have been pretty disastrous. And I'm pretty sure that, like me, if I would ever do something stupid and cause somebody else to be hurt, let alone die, that would destroy me. So I hope that he seeks whatever help he needs, deals with whatever legal issues he needs to with this, but puts this as a distant memory. Like there's a side of life that honestly, once I got off the OxyContin, and the friend that I shared this with recently, I said, I know this sounds weird as hell, but I was suddenly noticing things that I hadn't paid attention to since I was a kid. Sunrises, sunsets, the smell of cut grass that I love. Walking through the woods and seeing some wild flowers grow over there. Corny, almost like rainbows, lollipops, and unicorns, right? But for 5 years, it was nothing but OxyContin, OxyContin, OxyContin. Now I'm seeing these types of things that are pretty damn beautiful. That there's an incredible world out there. It's because we don't have wrestling anymore as our primary source of attention or affection. There's an awful lot of world out there to interact with, and I hope and pray that Buff takes that route.
Michael would like to know if you have any Rick Rude stories.
Oh yeah, a million of them. First of all, for anybody that was well versed in Rick Rude, I think you can see a lot of similarities in the franchise character. That was homage for me because I was a huge Rick Rude mark. The back when he was doing that in WWF in the 80s and 90s, you know, the swivel of the hips and the abs and the bringing one of the girls in, from the audience and laying her down and all. That was so different at the time and so cool to me as a kid watching. So later when I got to work with him and then learn from him and then work with him, like outside of the ring, you saw a side of Rick that you never saw in the ring, right? That was the character. He was a guy that was brilliant on bodybuilding and supplements, legal ones. He would tell me like, diet, that protein powder is shit, take this one, that kind of thing. But he had a mind for the business, and people don't often think this way when they talk about psychologists. Rick really understood the nuances of a heel getting heat and getting a babyface over. In fact, years later in ECW, there was one that I'd worked with Pitbull number one, or two rather, quite often, right? Brain fart. Throwing too many names around now, but Pitbull number two, right? The bigger bald one. His name will pop in my head the second chair shots. But when he finally got into the comfort zone of trusting me, those were some of my better matches of my career because I was so at ease and I had this big cock strong guy that could throw me around, could do pretty much anything and athletic as hell. That once I was at ease, he was at ease. So it was like, sort of us, now became a dance. We're dance partners. And, we always had good matches. And Anthony Durante, how I could forget that. But anyway, he, one night we were in Trenton, New Jersey, Trenton, CYO. And we were doing a 6-man tag, and I gave him a spot and the spot would be I'd slide through his legs, leg diving, surfboard on his back for a second, run my mouth. A couple seconds later, when I try to do it again, he stops me, catches me up at a choke slam, slams me, and then presses me over his head and throws me to the floor to Bammer and Chris. He said, got it, walks away. Comes back a few minutes later, and he'd never done this before. He said, Shane, I was thinking about that spot. I think it makes me look stupid. So it doesn't make you look stupid. And I explained the psychology to him, blah, blah, blah. And he okay, and he leaves. A few minutes later, comes back again, goes, I don't know, Shane. I think it's going to make me look stupid. And I said, I explained it to him again. I'm thinking, this is strange because he never asked me, never questioned me on a spot ever before that. So about the 4th or 5th time this goes on, I followed him over to his dressing room. There were a bunch of smaller dressing rooms there, with doors and things on them. So I followed him over, and he goes in and closes the door, but leaves it cracked. So I look in the crack, and I'm listening. Rick Rude's in there with him, and Rick's saying, he's going to make you look silly in the ring. A good heel would never do that. So we go out to eat afterwards that night. Again, my reverence and respect for Rick, plus respect for being a badass, right? And I said to him, as far as the spot, I said, hey, what was the deal tonight with Anthony? And he said, a good heel would never do that. And I said, well, I'm thinking, okay, it's coming from a pretty great heel. And then he cut to, he went straight from that to, you're a shitty fucking heel. And I said, okay, Rick, I'll bite. Why am I a shitty heel? And he said, because a great heel has more heat in their hometown than any place else. Beckoning back, he's right, to old school philosophy. In ECW, we used Pittsburgh as sort of like the inverse universe because I'd been wrestling for years at that point, 11, 12, 13, 14 years, give or take, I forget exactly what year it was. I'd been a world tag team champion. I'd been a TV champion. I'd held several titles at that point. And I understood what Paul was doing. We can go to Pittsburgh and do angles that we can't do anywhere else. It won't make sense anyplace else, but we can do them here. It's sort of like Marvel Comics used to have the What If comic books, and no matter how I tried to explain that to Rick, he just was so old school. He could not fathom it being done a different way. But the funniest story I can tell you about Rick was the night. Funny to an extent. We were in Reading, Pennsylvania, doing taping. This is the night that I got attacked by a fan, and I think Rob Van Dam got attacked by a fan. So we wrestle Tommy. Me and Francine wrestle Tommy and Beulah. They go over, and I think Beulah pinned me, of course, if that's the same match I'm thinking. And afterwards, we're getting post-match heat on them. Rude hits the ring, right? Because this is when he was there to fuck with the franchise. Excuse me. So Franny and I powder out the back of the ring and split the posts to meet, in my head, meet back up in the alleyway and get the hell out of here. So I get back to the entrance. When I turn around, no Francine. I look back and she's stuck on the back side of the ring. I'm probably 50 yards from the ring, and I could see Rick Rude's face beat red like this time cue up here, right? His face is beat red. Get your bitch out of here, just ready to explode. That was Rick, right? We're out here in front of the audience. We kayfabe in front of the audience. And in his mind, she's making me look like shit. Again, beckoning back to that old school. So great guy, learned a ton from him, and another guy gone way too soon.
Will C would like to know how your relationship today is with Ric Flair.
No relationship. I had done the best I could to try to make amends with him in two ways. After his son Reed died, a few weeks later, we were on a show in Rostraver Ice Gardens in Pittsburgh. And I walked up to him. I said, first thing I said was, Rick, all of our past behind us. I said, my heart breaks for you, brother. I can't even imagine what you're going through. And the next time was whenever a couple of years ago, and he had the big health scare. I'm online, and I didn't get a call from anybody. I'd gotten, was online and saw like everybody else was seeing it, and posted up on my Twitter account. And I meant it then, and I mean it now. We have seen enough of our brothers and sisters put into graves way too early. I mean, how many we talked about just in this short time? So, I wished him well then. I send prayers for him, the whole thing. And then sometime after that, I see him, started burying me online again. So I think it's just a dance that Rick likes. When we're face to face, he's a pussycat. I've always had reverence for Rick and respect for Rick's in-ring work. Him as a man, not so much. I don't expect him to be perfect. I'm far from perfect. But I do expect, just like it was done to him, somebody handed him the knowledge of wrestling, and I expected the same thing as a kid. I try to do the same thing today in passing on that knowledge to other people. So no relationship, which I think is sort of a shame, right? To me, that was 25 years ago or longer. I got bigger things to worry about, like a hangnail. That's more day to day to me than worried about Ric Flair or anybody else in or out of the business.
Now, there's about 10 minutes left. Do you want to hold this off for another time, or do you have time to finish it?
Yeah, we better finish it off. Hold off. I may be able to do